The bull stood like a black mountain in a world of dust. Around him, Alara's small pasture was a defiant patch of green, an island in a sea of cracked, beige earth. His herd, her herd, grazed with a slow calm that felt like a prayer in the shimmering heat. Beyond her fences, the vast Sterling ranch was a boneyard. Rib cages of cattle dotted the landscape like shipwrecks, and the wind, when it blew, carried not the scent of grass but the fine, choking powder of a dead world. The great Sterling Creek was a dry, stony wound. It was August, the month of judgment, and judgment had been delivered. One person alone, they had said, a woman alone, and she was. But it was the world that had failed, not her. 2 years earlier, none of this was written. The world was still green, or green enough, and Alara Vance was just a ghost haunting the edges of a life that had been taken from her. She had a small plot of land left to her by a husband the fever took, a piece of ground so marginal it was mostly a tax burden. It was considered the ranch's hindquarter, the bit you trim off and feed to the dogs. The soil was thin, and the little creek that cut through it was fickle, a lyre that ran bold in spring and vanished by July. She had a cabin, a well that was more hope than water, and a silence that had grown so vast it had its own sound. That April, she was walking the fence line, checking the wire her husband had strung, when she saw the vultures circling over Sterling's calving pasture. It was a common enough sight. Calving season was a brutal arithmetic of life and loss. But something drew her closer. Through the wire, she could see the herd moving off, a slow river of red and black hide, mothers nudging their strong new calves along. But one was left behind. It was a heap of dark hide, no bigger than a hound, lying flat and still in the trampled grass. As she watched, a wagon rumbled up. John Sterling himself was at the reins, a man whose wealth was so old and solid it seemed like a feature of the landscape. He climbed down, thick and confident, and nudged the calf with his boot. It gave a feeble bleat, a sound thin as a thread. Sterling grunted, a sound of finality. He said something to his hand, who shrugged and climbed back on the wagon. They were leaving it. For the coyotes, for the birds. It was the sensible thing to do. A runt that small would never make it. It would drink more milk than it was worth, and likely die anyway. It was bad business to save it. Alara stood frozen. She watched the wagon pull away, leaving the tiny creature alone in the enormous field. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. The sun climbed higher. The vultures dipped lower. She thought of her empty cabin, of the echoing quiet, of the arithmetic of her own life, which was all subtraction. Then she moved. She didn't think. She just did. She found a loose section of wire, slipped through the fence, and walked to the calf. It was a bull calf, and he was colder than he should be, his coat matted and his great dark eyes clouded with a coming end. He tried to lift his head when she knelt, a last spark of defiance. "Well?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "It seems we're two of a kind." She gathered the calf into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of bone and a flickering heartbeat. She staggered back to the fence, wriggled him under, and then followed. She carried him the half-mile to her cabin, her arms screaming, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She laid him on a burlap sack by the cold stove, every man in the county's voice of reason echoing in her head. A waste of time. A waste of milk. Sentiment is a luxury for the rich, Alara. She ignored them all. She had nothing, which meant she had nothing to lose. She was one person alone. That was a weakness. But it was also a freedom. She had no one to answer to, no one to tell her she was a fool. She would be the only witness to her own folly. Old Man Hemlock found her the next day, trying to coax a bit of her own precious canned milk, watered down, into the calf's mouth. Hemlock lived 2 miles down the dry creek, a German immigrant who had carved out a small, fiercely neat farm that everyone likewise ignored. He was old, with hands like gnarled roots and eyes the color of a winter sky. He leaned on her doorframe, silent for a long time, just watching. Alara didn't stop her work, her shoulders tense, expecting the same pitying scorn she'd get in town. "Sterling's?" Hemlock finally asked. His voice was thick with an accent, slow and deliberate. Alara nodded, not looking up. "He left it, Ja?" Hemlock came inside, his smell a mix of good soil and pipe tobacco. He looked down at the calf, which was shivering, its life a flickering candle flame. He didn't scoff. He didn't lecture her on ranching economics. He simply knelt, his old knees cracking, and laid a hand on the calf's bony spine. He was quiet for another minute. Alara found herself holding her breath. "In the old country," he said, his voice soft, "we have a saying. Got mist ein ding nicht nachter gross, mit der es beginnt." He saw her confusion. God does not measure a thing by the size it starts. Alara felt a strange loosening in her chest. It was the first time in a year a person had spoken to her with something other than pity or dismissal. He looked at the watery milk in the bowl. This will not do. It will scour him from the inside out. He then proceeded to give her a recipe. It was a strange concoction involving a raw egg, a dollop of lard, and a splash of molasses, all mixed into warm water. "An old wife's tale," he said with a small smile. But the old wives, they saw many calves. They knew things the men with the account books forgot. He stayed while she mixed it, his presence a quiet comfort in the small cabin. He showed her how to dip her fingers in the mixture and let the calf suck them, teaching it to drink. The little animal, which had refused everything else, took to it with a desperate, surprising strength. By the time Hemlock left, the calf had taken down a whole bowl and was curled on the burlap, breathing more deeply than before. He paused at the door. "You have a good heart, Alara Vance. On this land, that is sometimes a liability. But sometimes," he looked out at her bare little yard, "it is the only thing that will grow." The news, of course, traveled. News of a foolish woman doing a foolish thing was the most entertaining gossip the small town of Promise had. When she went to the mercantile for flour and salt, she could feel the conversation stop. She could hear the silence that followed her down the aisle. Jed, the store owner, leaned on the counter. "Heard you've taken up veterinary work, Alara." The men sitting around the stove chuckled. "More like necromancy," one of them muttered. Trying to raise Sterling's leavings, she placed her items on the counter, her face still and unreadable. She had learned long ago that to argue with mockery was to feed it. Silence was the only shield she had. "It's your money," Jed said, his tone suggesting she had very little of it to waste. "But a calf that small, you'd have done better to buy a chicken." She paid her coin, picked up her sack, and walked out, the sound of their laughter following her like stones thrown at her back. She did the arithmetic that night, by the light of a single candle, the calf asleep at her feet. The cost of the lard, the eggs from her 3 scrawny hens, the molasses. It was a cost she couldn't really afford. But then she looked at the calf, whose sides were now rising and falling with a steady rhythm. It was the only other heartbeat in her house. She decided then and there. They could all laugh. Being right was its own kind of reply, and she would wait for it. By June, the calf was not only alive, he was a problem. He had an appetite that defied his origins, and a rate of growth that was unnerving. He was no longer a creature she could keep by the stove. He was sturdy on his legs, thick in the neck, and had a coat of black hair so glossy it shone like wet velvet. She moved him to the small, rickety pen behind the cabin. He hated it. He would stand at the fence and issue low, mournful bellows until she came out. He behaved less like a bovine and more like a lonely, oversized dog. He would follow her as she did her chores, nudging her back with his solid head, licking her hands with a tongue as rough as a file. She hadn't named him. Naming him felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. It was a boy from town, Finn, who gave him his name. Finn was a reedy, quiet child of about 10, with eyes that saw everything and a mouth that said little. He was the blacksmith's son, a boy who seemed to prefer the company of animals to people. He started appearing at her fence line in the evenings, just watching. Alara, accustomed to being an object of speculation, ignored him at first. But the boy wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the calf. One day, she was mending a fence post, and the calf was helping, which meant he was rubbing his head against her back and making it impossible to work. The boy spoke from the other side of the fence. "He's big, he is," Alara said, not stopping her work. "What's his name?" "He doesn't have one." The boy was quiet for a moment. He pointed to a small, perfect circle of white hair on the calf's broad forehead. "Looks like a Button." From then on, that was his name. Button. It was a ridiculous name for an animal that was quickly becoming anything but small. Finn started coming by every day after his father was done at the forge. He never asked permission. He just slipped through the fence and started helping. He'd haul buckets of water from the well, which was getting harder for Alara as the summer deepened and the water level dropped. He'd talk to Button, a constant, low murmur, and the young bull would stand with his head lowered, utterly content. The presence of the boy changed the rhythm of her loneliness. The silence in the cabin was still there, but it wasn't as loud. The town watched this new development with the same mix of pity and amusement. A lonely woman and a strange boy, wasting their time on a worthless piece of livestock. Sterling himself rode by one afternoon. He reined in his magnificent bay horse and looked down at Button, who was now the size of a full-grown heifer. The bull stared back, unafraid. There was a flicker of something in Sterling's eyes. Not respect. Not yet. Annoyance, maybe. As if a piece of trash he'd thrown away had inconveniently refused to disappear. Still got that thing, I see, Sterling said, his voice coated in false warmth. He's looking healthy, he is, Alara said, her voice flat. Amazing what a little care can do. Sterling's smile tightened. Don't get your hopes up. A bad start is a bad start. Blood tells, and his blood is thin. He spurred his horse and rode on, leaving the dust to settle. That night, Alara felt a cold knot of fear. What if he was right? What if she was pouring her hope and her meager resources into a genetic dead end? She went out to the pen. Button came to her, resting his heavy head on her shoulder. His strength was a real and solid thing. It felt more real than Sterling's words. She resolved to work harder. She spent the rest of the summer and fall reinforcing her fences, clearing brush, and, most importantly, tending to her well. While others in the valley trusted the creek, Alara trusted only what she could make with her own 2 hands. She deepened the well by 6 feet, digging in the cool of the morning, hauling up buckets of dirt and rock until her hands were raw. She found a small, persistent seep at the far corner of her property, a place where the ground was always damp. She dug a basin there, lining it with clay, creating a small cistern that held the precious moisture. It was backbreaking, solitary work. But every time she felt her resolve waver, she would look at Button. He was her secret, her gamble, the living proof that she could make something from nothing. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek, which had been a friend in spring, shrank to a trickle and then to a series of stagnant, algae-choked pools. The great pastures of the valley, including Sterling's, began to fade from green to yellow to a brittle, uniform brown. The sun was a merciless hammer in a white-hot sky. But in Alara's small corner of the world, things were different. The deepened, while still gave water, sweet and cold. The cistern by the seep was a third full, a treasure she guarded jealously. And Button was no longer a calf. He was a bull. He was magnificent. He was bigger than any 2-year-old bull she had ever seen, with the deep chest and powerful hindquarters of a seasoned herd sire. His black coat shone with health, and the white spot on his forehead seemed less like a button and more like a star. He was still gentle, a strange and comic dignity about him. He would follow Finn around the pasture like a shadow, allowing the boy to scrub his back with a stiff brush and lean against his warm, solid flank. The town's mockery had mostly fallen silent now, replaced by a grudging, bewildered curiosity. No one could deny what was before their eyes. The runt was a giant. The joke had become a wonder. But a bull alone is not a herd. Alara knew this. The arithmetic had changed. It was no longer about keeping one animal alive. It was about building a future. She had no money to buy cows. A good heifer cost more than she made in a year of selling eggs and mending clothes. So she did what she always did. She watched, she thought, and she used what others overlooked. She went to her neighbors, the small-time farmers with 1 or 2 scrawny cows that Sterling wouldn't even look at. She made them a proposition. Not for money. For a share. Let me pasture your cow for the season, she'd say. I have water and some grass. In return, I get to keep every other calf my bull sires on her. It was a strange deal, but these were men on the edge. Their own pastures were failing. The idea of their cow getting free grazing and a chance at a calf from the now legendary Vance bull was a gamble they were willing to take. 3 of them agreed. They brought her their animals, a swayback Jersey, a nervous little Hereford, and an old black cow with 1 blind eye. They were a sorry-looking trio, the cast-offs of the cattle world. Sterling would have laughed. Alara welcomed them. Button, who had been the sole bovine on the property for 2 years, regarded the new arrivals with a solemn curiosity. Within a week, he had dutifully, gently, serviced them all. The summer wore on. The drought tightened its grip. The air grew thick with the smoke of distant grass fires. The men in town started talking in lower voices. Their bravado was cracking. They talked about culling their herds, about selling off breeding stock for pennies on the pound just to cut their losses. Sterling's operation, with its thousands of head, was bleeding money. He had too many mouths and not enough water. He was hauling it in by the barrel, a costly and desperate measure. One evening, Sterling's foreman, a hard man named Cole, rode up to Alara's fence. He didn't dismount. He looked at her 3 cows and Button, all grazing peacefully in the green pasture. He looked at the glint of water in her cistern. His eyes were narrowed, full of a sour envy. "Sterling wants to know your price," he said, without preamble. For the bull, Alara felt a chill, despite the heat. "He's not for sale. Everything's for sale, lady. Name a price." "He is not for sale," she repeated, each word a stone. Cole spat on the ground. "You're a fool. You're sitting on a winning ticket, and you won't cash it. What's one woman gonna do with a bull like that anyway?" He wheeled his horse around and galloped off. The visit left her shaken. It was the first sign that the dynamic had truly shifted. They didn't just see a curiosity anymore. They saw an asset. They saw something they wanted. And Sterling was a man who was used to getting what he wanted. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was not over. By the 3rd week of August, the valley was a place of desperation. The creek bed was bone dry, a highway of pale, cracked stones. The sound of the wind in the brittle grass was like a whisper of ruin. Men who had been proud ranchers, their wealth measured in hoof and horn, were now gaunt-faced and hollow-eyed. They were shipping their cattle east at ruinous prices, watching their life's work load onto dusty train cars, never to return. The town of Promise felt like a funeral parlor. It is a terrible thing to watch a proud man be broken by the sky. It is worse to watch a whole town of them break at once. Alara's small farm, however, remained an oasis. Her careful husbanding of the well and the seep meant she still had water. Her pasture, not overgrazed, was still alive. Her 4 animals were calm and healthy. And then, the first of the calves was born. The old blind cow delivered in the cool of the night, a perfect, strong-boned heifer calf. She was black like Button, with the same sturdy frame. A week later, the Jersey dropped her calf, a bull, smaller but with his father's deep chest. The Hereford followed soon after. 3 calves. 3 perfect, healthy calves, sired by the bull everyone had dismissed, born in the heart of a killer drought. They were more than just animals. They were proof. They were the answer to every jeer, every pitying look, every whispered doubt. They were her vindication, small and loud and alive. She kept the news quiet, like a coal banked low under ash. But secrets have a way of getting out in a small town. Finn, who was there for every birth, was too full of joy to be entirely silent. He told his father, the blacksmith, who told Jed at the mercantile, and soon, the whole town knew. Alara Vance, the foolish woman with the runt bull, had new calves. Healthy calves, while the rest of them were losing everything. The mood shifted again. The grudging curiosity turned into something sharper, something with an edge. Envy. It's easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Now they had to face both. The thing they mocked was thriving, and their own wisdom had led them to ruin. One afternoon, a dusty buggy pulled up to her gate. It was not a local vehicle. The man who climbed out was dressed in city clothes, a crisp suit that looked out of place in the dust and heat. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a cattle buyer from Denver. "I'm here to see the Sterling herd," he said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Or what's left of it. But on the way, I heard a rumor. Rumors are cheap in Promise," Alara said, her hand resting on the gate. "This one said there was a bull out here siring calves that looked like they were carved from granite, in the middle of the worst drought in a decade. Said they were born of scrub cows." I didn't believe it. Alara was silent. She simply opened the gate and led him to the pasture. Abernathy stopped. He stared at Button, who watched him with placid, intelligent eyes. He walked around the bull, his city shoes crunching on the dry earth, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to pure, unadulterated awe. "My God," he breathed. "I've never seen a bull with a frame like that." Never. Then he saw the calves. He knelt, running his hands over the heifer's strong back, checking the breadth of her chest, the solid set of her legs. He did the same with the other 2. He stood up, dusty and sweating, and looked at Alara as if seeing her for the first time. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of respect, "these are not just good calves. These are the foundation of a new line. Their conformation, it's flawless." He pulled out a checkbook. "I will give you $300 for the bull calf." Right now, Alara's heart hammered in her chest. $300 was more money than she had seen in her life. It would mean a new well, good breeding cows, security. It would mean the end of the bitter arithmetic of survival. But the calf belonged to her neighbor, part of their deal. He's not mine to sell, she said, her voice steady. The heifer is mine, and she is not for sale. Abernathy looked disappointed, then intrigued. A woman of principle. I respect that. Well, ma'am, when you do have stock to sell, you send word to me in Denver. I will pay any price you ask. Any price. He left, and Alara stood watching his dust trail, the offer hanging in the hot, still air. She had done it. She had been right. But the victory felt fragile. Abernathy's visit had put a number on her success. And now, everyone knew exactly what she was sitting on. The very next day, John Sterling came to call. He did not come on horseback, proud and high. He came in a buggy, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him, his face lined with the gray exhaustion of a man watching his empire crumble. He did not stay at the gate. He came to her cabin door, his hat in his hands. It was the posture of a supplicant, but his eyes still held the glint of a predator. Alara, he said, his voice smooth as worn leather. I've come to admit I was wrong. Alara waited, saying nothing. This was a new tactic. Mockery had failed. Threats had failed. Now came the false warmth, the feigned humility. That bull, he's a miracle. An absolute miracle. And what you've done here, with this land, it's remarkable. Truly. He paused, letting the flattery settle. But these are hard times. A drought like this, it tests everyone. It takes more than just a good bull to survive it. It takes resources. It takes scale. A woman alone, even one as capable as you, can't hold out forever. He got to the point. I want to make you a partner. Bring your animals into my operation. I have the infrastructure, the connections. We'll protect your foundation stock, breed them with my remaining heifers. We'll rebuild together. You'll be a wealthy woman. It was a tempting offer. It was also a lie. She knew what would happen. Her herd would be swallowed by his. Button would become his bull. The calves would be his calves. She would be given a pittance and be absorbed, her victory erased and rewritten as a footnote in the Sterling story. She looked past him, at her small, green pasture, at the animals that were the sum of her labor and her faith. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice quiet but firm. But my herd is staying here. Sterling's face hardened, the mask of friendliness slipping. The predator was back in his eyes. That's a mistake, Alara. A big one. This valley is a community. People are suffering. Their cattle are dying. And you're sitting over here on your little patch of green with your miracle bull, hoarding water and grass. That doesn't look good. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a cold, hard promise. People get desperate when their children are hungry. They might not be so respectful of your fences. He left, and the air felt colder in his wake. The fear she'd felt before returned, sharper this time. He was going to turn the town against her. He would use their pain and their envy as a weapon. She was one person alone. For the first time, she felt the true weight of those words. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her small table, the silence of the cabin pressing in. She thought of Sterling's words. Hoarding. Was that what she was doing? She looked at her reflection in the dark window pane, a pale, tired face. The arithmetic had returned, but it was no longer about money. It was about survival in a world of desperate men. She had won her gamble, but she was in danger of losing everything in the moment of her triumph. She thought of Old Man Hemlock's words. A good heart is sometimes a liability. Was this that time? Was she supposed to let them take what she had built, simply because they had more need? No, that wasn't justice. That was theft dressed up in the language of community. But what was the alternative? To stand guard with a rifle? To become as hard and merciless as the land around her? She got up and walked outside. The moon was a sliver in a sky full of cold, distant stars. Button came to the fence, a vast, dark shape in the night. She rested her forehead against his, and his familiar, warm scent filled her senses. He was real. The land was real. Her work was real. She would not let a man's greed and a town's fear take it from her. She would have to find another way, a way that was her own. The confrontation came 2 days later. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the dust. She saw them coming from a long way off, a dark mass of people on foot and on horseback, moving slowly down the road toward her farm. At their head was John Sterling. Alara's heart went cold and hard in her chest. This was it. She had sent Finn home early, telling him she had a feeling a storm was coming, though the sky was painfully clear. She stood on her small porch, her hands clasped behind her back to keep them from shaking. She would not hold a rifle. She would meet them with nothing but herself. They stopped at her gate, a crowd of about 20 men, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on her green pasture. They were her neighbors, men she'd known her whole life, men who had laughed at her. Now they looked at her with a mixture of awe and anger, a dangerous combination. Sterling sat on his horse, looking down at them all, the benevolent patriarch guiding his flock. "Alara," he called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "Your neighbors have come to talk. They've lost nearly everything. Their herds are gone. Their wells are dry. They're asking why one person should have so much when so many have nothing." A man in the crowd, a farmer named Peters whose land bordered hers, shouted, "It ain't right. We're starving out here, and she's got water to spare." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. They were a mob in the making, and Sterling was holding the match. Alara took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this. She had found her own way. She walked down from the porch and approached the gate, stopping just inside her property. She did not look at Sterling. She looked at the men, at Peters, at the blacksmith, at the others. "Mr. Peters," she said, her voice clear and steady, much louder than they expected. "I have water. That is true. Is it also true that last spring, you laughed at me in town for deepening my well?" Peters flushed, looking down at his boots. "And you, Mr. Garvey," she said, pointing to another man. "Did you not tell Jedediah that I was a fool for digging a cistern where the ground was marshy?" The man shuffled his feet. She went on, her voice never rising, never breaking. She wasn't accusing them. She was simply stating facts. She was reminding them. "For 2 years, you all called this my folly. You called him." She gestured to Button, who stood behind her, watching the crowd with his calm eyes. "Coyote meat. You said I was a foolish woman wasting her time. You were all very certain in your wisdom. You were certain I would fail." A deep, uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. She had turned their own words back on them, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. "You are right," she continued. "I have water. I have grass. I have healthy animals. It is not because I was lucky. It is because I worked. I dug when you were resting. I saved when you were spending. I saw value in what you threw away. This farm is not an accident. It is the result of labor you scorned." She paused, letting the truth of it sink in. "Now, your wisdom has failed you. And you have come here, led by the man who told me to leave my bull to die, to demand I give you the fruits of my labor. You have not come to ask. You have come to take." Sterling, seeing he was losing control, interrupted. "This is not the time for lectures, Alara. People are in need." "I know they are," Alara said, finally turning her eyes to him. And then she did the last thing any of them expected. She turned back to the crowd. "I will not be robbed," she said. "But I will not see my neighbors starve." Her words hung in the air. She made her offer. It was not the offer of a victim, but of a leader. "I have water. Enough for my animals, and some to spare. Any man who needs water for his family and his milk cow can have it. Bring your buckets. I will not charge you." A ripple of shock went through the men. "As for your herds," she went on, "I cannot save them, but I can help you rebuild. My neighbor, Mr. Schmidt, whose cow is here, will get his bull calf, as we agreed, and he will get it for free. My other neighbor, Mr. Cole, will get his. For the rest of you, when my heifer drops her first calf, I will sell it to one of you. Not at the price the Denver man offered. At a fair price. A neighbor's price. We will draw lots. And we will do the same the year after. We will rebuild this valley, together. With strong bloodlines and fair dealing." It was an act of breathtaking generosity, and it completely disarmed them. She was offering them a future, not just a handout. She was offering them dignity. The anger drained out of the crowd, replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. The blacksmith, Finn's father, was the first to speak. He stepped forward, taking off his hat. "She's right, John," he said, his voice rough with emotion, not looking at Sterling but at the other men. "She's right. We laughed at her. We were fools. Proud, arrogant fools. And she's offering us grace when we deserve damnation." Peters nodded, his face ashamed. "He's right." One by one, the men nodded. They turned away from Sterling, their backs a silent judgment. They looked at Alara, and for the first time, they truly saw her. Not as a foolish woman, not as a lonely widow, but as the person who had been right all along. The person who was now their only hope. Sterling sat on his horse, his face a mask of fury. He had been outmaneuvered, his own greed exposed by her quiet strength and stunning generosity. He had tried to use the town as his weapon, and instead, she had claimed the town as her own. Without another word, he yanked his horse's head around and galloped away, a solitary figure disappearing into the dust of his own ruined empire. A profound quiet settled. Then, the blacksmith walked to the gate. "Mrs. Vance," he said formally, "we'd be grateful for that water." Alara simply unlatched the gate and swung it open. That evening, a procession came to her well. Not a mob, but a line of humble, grateful neighbors. They filled their buckets, their eyes avoiding hers, their thanks muttered in low, ashamed voices. She did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply stood by her well, a quiet sentinel, and watched them. She had faced them down, not with force, but with fairness. She had won. The drought broke in September. A long, slow rain fell for 3 days, soaking into the thirsty ground, turning the world from dust to mud. It washed the valley clean. The creek began to flow again. But the landscape was forever changed. The great Sterling Ranch was broken, its herds decimated, its power shattered. Many of the smaller ranchers were gone, too. But a core remained, and they now looked to Alara Vance. Her herd grew. The 3 calves from that first year were the beginning. The heifer she kept, named Hope, grew into a fine cow who dropped strong calves year after year. The bull calves went to her neighbors, for fair prices, and the blood of the runt nobody wanted began to spread through the valley, strong and true. The Vance line, they called it. The cattle were known for their size, their hardiness, their calm temperament. They were animals built not for a boom, but for survival. They were animals built for promise. Old Man Hemlock lived to see it. He would come and sit with her on her porch, watching the herd graze. Finn, now a young man, worked alongside her, his devotion to the farm and the animals absolute. He was the son she never had, the future of the place she had built. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden light over the green pasture, Hemlock watched Button, now old and graying at the muzzle, standing like a king among his descendants. "Got missed and ding nicked knockter gross, mit der es begint," he said softly. Alara smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. "No," she agreed, her voice full of the quiet confidence she had earned. "He does not." She had started with nothing but a dying calf and the scorn of a whole town. She had faced drought and greed and fear. She had been one person, alone. It was not a weakness. It was the space she had needed to grow. She had learned the land's language, and in doing so, she had taught her neighbors a new arithmetic, not of profit and loss, but of resilience and grace. The runt had become the cornerstone, and the woman everyone pitied had become the quiet, unshakable heart of the valley.